Chapter 17. Priya. At first, Yogesh had struck Priya as a nervous man, but it didn't take her long to realize he was simply nervous of her. As they rode their horses along the winding dirt tracks and roads that led to Saketa, she saw him touching the prayer stones he wore around his neck. Each stone grasped one by one between his fingers as he mouthed the names of the Mothers of Flame to himself, as if that had the strength to ward away Priya's monstrousness. She would have been irritated by it, normally, but she was too worried to think long on Yogesh. "I can't reach Bhumika," she confided to Sima on the first evening. "What do you mean?" "I can't, you know." She made a vague gesture trying to encompass everything the Sangam was without talking about it in front of the Parijatvipan strangers. "I don't know why." Sima gave her a wide-eyed look. She understood, just as Priya did, how serious it was that Priya could not reach Ahiranya. "We can send one of our men back," Sima said. "They didn't have many to begin with. Karan, maybe. Or Nitin?" They couldn't afford to make their retinue even smaller. They were already a sorry group. A mere handful of Ahiranya's soldiers, Sima in her plain sari with her bow, and Priya dressed in temple elder whites that had already seen a few too many encounters with dust. She hadn't thought that she would need another way to contact Bhumika. She felt a pang when she'd left everyone behind, but she had thought it would be, in a way, just like any time she had traveled through Ahiranya to deal with the rot. Difficult, certainly, and lonely. But Bhumika would be there, waiting for her in the Sangha, waiting to advise and scold and stop Priya from doing anything impulsive that would land everyone who mattered to her in a pile of shit. Now Priya was on her own. "Karan," Priya said reluctantly. "We'll send him." "I'm sure everything's fine, Pri," Sima said. "Your sister will send someone after us too, the second she realizes she can't speak to you." What if she doesn't send anyone? Priya thought. What if something has happened? She looked at the path behind them, the dust of the road and the wizened trees, and Ahiranya already so far behind them that she could not see the Harana at all. "We could go back," Sima said after a moment. Priya swallowed, conflicted. "Let's give it a day," Priya said. "Either someone will come from Bhumika or someone won't. And then—" She couldn't continue. Worry was pulling coldly in her belly. "Someone will come," Sima said. Spirits. How long would it take for a fast rider to reach them from Ahiranya when they were still on the move? Could a rider catch up with them? How long should Priya wait before she turned back? "A few more days," she amended, settling on vagueness. When the worry became too much to stand, well, that would make her decision for her. Her soreness and exhaustion soon distracted her. Priya wasn't a natural rider. Jivan had insisted on giving her a handful of lessons alongside some guidance on handling scythe and saber. But her body ached that night when they lay down to rest, and despite her worries, her sleep was deep and dreamless. It wasn't until the morning that she realized the reason for her easy sleep. She could not hear the green. No Sangam and no green. The disquiet grew in her, setting roots right through her, tightening her lungs. She couldn't pretend any longer that everything was well. Perhaps everyone in Ahiranya was safe. Perhaps Priya was the problem. Her magic was fading out of her as swiftly as water through a cracked pot. Perhaps she had not strength beyond Ahiranya's borders, far from the gleaming blue of the deathless waters that had given her gifts to begin with. But that hadn't been the way of it in the birch bark mantras. The elders of old had possessed powers no matter where they went, had conquered the subcontinent alongside the Yaksa in the Age of Flowers with that magic. "I am not an elder of old," Priya reminded herself, her stomach in knots. She held her face in her hands. "I am something new, and maybe this was a terrible mistake." She was ready to shake Sima awake and tell her they needed to turn back when she suddenly felt something glance through her, something sharp and green, a dart arrowing through her blood, its hum settling in the back of her skull. She stood up sharply and scrambled out of her tent. Around her, the sleeping camp fumbled awake, the men on guard reaching instinctively for their weapons. "There's something," she said to the others, "beyond the trees." Immediately, her own men reached for their weapons, and the soldiers attending Yogesh drew their sabers. Priya swiftly shook her head. "Not like that," she said. No enemies or bandits. Look, there's no need for your swords. Give me a moment." "Priya," Sima said, "what?" "I can feel something," Priya said quickly, crossing the dusty ground. Ignoring Sima's protests and Yogesh's murmured cautions, she walked through the trees. They grew close together here, slender, branches twining into arches and webs around her. The scent of leaf, sap, and wet earth filled her nose at first, deep and lustrous and damp, then gave way quickly to something more pungent. Decay. Rot. She stopped. A few of the men had followed her, and now they gazed silently at the village that lay hidden between the trees and the modest clearing. It was clearly abandoned. The buildings were overgrown, small wood and stone houses caving in beneath the pressure of strangling roots, flowering bushes. All of the trees looked slightly wrong in a way that Priya had grown very familiar with. Their trunks appeared almost soft, the wood too forgiving. Where the bark had stripped or the surface splintered, the trees were deep color of exposed flesh, marbled with the white fat. She swallowed back nausea. "None of you should touch it," she said to the men. "Elder Priya," Yogesh said, clearing his throat. He sounded fairly nauseous himself. "We should not. The Empress would not want anyone to be risked. The business of burning the trees can be left to the local villagers." "What villagers?" Priya asked. "There is no one here. They're all long gone." Yogesh's soldiers made uneasy noises, but they soon melted back, returning to the path, leaving her alone with the trees. "I'm staying," said Sima quietly. "Sima, it won't be interesting. Someone has to keep an eye on you." She crossed her arms. There was no point arguing, and Priya didn't want to remain here, smelling the stink of rotting meat, any longer than she had to. As she stepped closer, the call of green and life inside her grew stronger. Her limbs felt steadier. Some weakness she hadn't even been aware of sleeping out of her. Priya closed her eyes, reached, and finally blessedly felt the green reaching back. She pushed herself through the green, through the Sangam, through cosmic rivers and the deathless waters that ran through her blood, and grasped at the rot. Froze it to stillness. It would grow no further now. When she returned to herself, she was gasping, lungs heaving, and Sima was holding her up. They were both leaning back against the healthy tree, still alone. It couldn't have been long, then. "I told you that you needed someone to keep an eye on you," Sima said, voice a little shaky. Priya managed a laugh. "Maybe you're right," she said. "Come on, we'd better head back." They straightened up and returned to the soldiers. Behind them the trees had settled, nearly alive again, the ground around them resting as easy, the sweet scent of fresh grass now the only smell in the air. "Did you know there was rot this far from home?" Sima asked, voice a whisper. "No," Priya whispered in return. Her blood still hummed and sang distractingly, warm with relief. She wasn't broken after all. But she didn't know why her magic had faded to begin with, and that worried her. That night, lying on a mat on the ground with Sima beside her, she tried to reach for Bhumika again. It felt like she was learning how to walk a familiar path with her eyes closed. It could be done. Her feet knew this particular soil, the way this path curved and dipped, but she'd always had her eyes to rely on before, and now she had only her skin. She closed her real, not metaphorical, eyes, and breathed deep, slow, deep, slow. She sank under her skin in old and practiced motion, seeking the Sangam. If she could reach Bhumika, she could at least reassure her sister that Priya was safe and sound, and she could reassure herself that everyone in Ahiranya was safe too. Maybe then she could continue on this journey without fear of what may lie behind her. The waters opened up to her, radiant darkness. Waves lapping around her as stars slipped their perches to whirl at her feet. "Priya!" Bhumika was kneeling in the waters. 3 rivers swirled around her. She was smiling, a fixed, even smile that looked strange on the shadow of her face. "You're finally here. Did I worry you?" "Of course I did. I'm sorry. I couldn't get here. She shrugged helplessly, relief pouring through her. Honestly, Bhumika, I am not sure when I'll be able to get here again, so let me tell you everything I can. She spoke of the journey, the rot, the fear in Yogesh's weary eyes, his prayer stones, his watchful men, the strangeness of feeling distant and disconnected from the power she'd possessed in Ahiranya, and Bhumika listened to all of it wordlessly, fixed and still. "Why are you still smiling?" Priya asked eventually. "Are you really that happy to have me gone? Weren't you worried at all? I'm going to start feeling insulted." "I'm just glad to see you," Bhumika said. "It's been too long. I was worried." "Is everything all right in Hiranaprastha?" Priya asked. "Padma's fine, and Rook?" Bhumika inclined her head. "Everyone is well," she said, "just as they should be." Bhumika reached out and touched a hand to Priya's face, the shadow of it shaping Priya's cheek. "Go back to yourself," she said. "We'll see each other soon enough." "We may not," Priya said urgently. "Bhumika, don't you understand? I'm not sure if I'll always be able to reach out. If you send a messenger, it'll take weeks. But if something's important, you will, won't you? If you can't reach me here like this." The shadow of Bhumika's mouth, the shape of her teeth. "Of course," Bhumika said. "I'll find you when you're needed. I promise you that. Don't worry about using your strength to call me in the Sangam. Focus on what lies ahead. But just do as I say, Priya," Bhumika said. Her words were gentle, but they were also an order. "Now go." Priya returned to her body, stared out at the dark, breathing unevenly now, feeling odd and unsteady, some sense of wrongness grappling at the edges of her consciousness. Eventually she slept. By the time she woke in the morning and broke her fast, and heaved herself once again onto her horse, the strangeness of it all had dissipated like nothing more than a bad dream. The army encampment was marked by banners on the horizon, all of them the gleaming white and gold of Imperial Parijatvipa, blazing in the light of the setting sun. Despite the fact that they had traveled weeks to get here, Yogesh insisted on stopping and making camp. "I think we should continue," Priya said, trying to channel Bhumika's effortless command. It didn't seem to be doing her much good. The men kept on setting up camp, ignoring her. "We're almost there. The Empress is waiting for us." "It would be better to take a moment here," Yogesh said, with exquisite awkwardness, his eyes darting anywhere but to her. "Night is almost here, Elder." "All the more reason to join the Empress's camp," Priya retorted. "No, no," Yogesh said, wringing his hands. "It will give you time to prepare, Elder. You look out of sorts." "You do smell," Sima muttered when they were alone. "Well, so do you," said Priya. "I'm not Ahiranya's representative," Sima pointed out. "You are. I'm just a maid." "I could tell people you're my bodyguard," Priya said. There was an incredulous silence from Sima. "If I could emulate Elder Bhumika at all, I hope you know I'd be raising an eyebrow at you right now," Sima said. "One devastating look of judgment. That's what you'd get." "Well, you're not just a maid. Certainly not my maid. Isn't that the point of this? Coming here with me? You're a representative of Ahiranya," Priya shrugged. "Maybe that's enough." "You know that isn't how things work for Highborn," Sima said. "They need names for things, like everything and everyone to have their place." Sima was right, of course. "Advisor," Priya said after a beat. "We can call you my advisor." "Advisor," Sima repeated. She sounded skeptical. "It'll mean more to the Parijatvipans than friend who helps me kill Parijati soldiers will." "Fine," Sima said. "Advisor it is. Now go wash yourself, Pri, and leave your advisor alone." Priya had only just finished bathing with a cloth and bucket behind a hastily erected sheet, Sima on guard, when she heard hurried footsteps. "Priya," Nitin called out. "Elder Priya." He corrected himself quickly. "You have to come. She's here. The Empress is here." Her heart gave a strange thud in her chest. From the side of the sheet, Sima turned and met her gaze, eyes wide. "I'll be there in a moment," Priya called out, and tried to make herself presentable. Her sari was a little damp, her skin faintly shiny with water, when she emerged and drew a shawl around her shoulders to hide worst of her damage. There was a chariot coming to a stop, soldiers alighting from their own mounts. The shoulders parted, a parasol was raised, beaded with darts of silver, its gleaming even in the shadows, the figure that alighted from the chariot, protecting her from the fading sunlight. Malini. She was not as thin as she'd once been, and her hair, always so knotted and curling when Priya had known her, had been carefully tamed into a braided bun bound high at her scalp. But her face was the same dark gray eyes, almost black, the severe eyebrows, the fullness of her mouth not quite shaping a smile. Empress, Yogesh murmured and bowed low. His men followed his example. Around Priya, Jivan's men hesitated, but when Priya bowed, they followed suit. Priya raised her head. Malini was watching her. Once her expression would have been unreadable to Priya, a blank mask, all perfection and stillness. But she knew Malini's face now, had once watched every flicker of her eyelids, every exhale from her lips, and learned them like language. Beneath the shadow of her parasol, Malini's dark eyes were taking in every inch of Priya's form. Her damp skin, the tuck of her sari at her waist, her trailing hair draped over her shoulder, Priya's face. Malini was looking at nothing and no one else. Only Priya, with her mouth a little parted and her eyes a little wider than normal. Malini had missed her too. Elder Priya, said Malini, I have come to speak with you, if we may have privacy. Of course, Empress. Priya nodded at her men and Sima, who nodded in return and stepped away. Yogesh was murmuring something, shaking his head. There is no need for formal record of this conversation, Malini replied. Empress, Yogesh protested. Malini gave the lightest flick of her head, and Yogesh swallowed and bowed and stepped back to join the other men. Priya looked at Malini, simply looked at her. The chariot was all gilt and silver behind her. There were flowers in her hair, carved from jewels and ivory, earth and bone. I am sorry to come to you so suddenly without warning, Malini said after a moment. If I had warned anyone, my courtiers would have followed, and I wanted... Malini trailed off, but Priya knew. We're still watched, Priya said softly. I know, Malini said, but some modicum of privacy is better than nothing. Malini, she wanted to say, wanted to shape that name in her mouth. She took one step forward, just one step. But Malini shook her head subtly, and Priya took no more. I want you to see, Malini murmured. Before I faced you in front of all my men, I wanted you to see what I am now. Priya found some breath inside herself. You certainly look like an empress. And you look like an elder of Ahiranya, said Malini. Priya couldn't help but laugh, almost noiseless, almost breathless, like the sound didn't want to leave her. I look like a mess, she said. No, you look... What? More alive than I remember, Malini said softly. I didn't think such a thing was possible, but here we are. Are you well? Happy? It makes me happy to see you, she almost said, but that wasn't quite right. Seeing Malini made it feel like there was something fragile in her chest, something that could wither or flourish at a single word, a single touch. I am. Are you? Malini smiled in response, tight-lipped. That's a no then, Priya said. I am. But, Priya, in the eyes of my men, Ahiranya is not yet free, said Malini. Ahiranya is still subordinate, and you will be unwelcome. The fragile thing in Priya's chest splintered, just a little. Malini's words were a reminder that there was so much more at stake than her soft feelings for Malini or Malini's for her. Politics and war and history all stood like a chasm between them. You summoned me, Priya pointed out. Yes, said Malini. I did, because I am on precarious ground, because I need someone I can trust, and because... She stopped and then said carefully, because you are you, to me. Priya felt a pang. Oh, Malini. But you are going to need to trust me in turn, Priya, she went on. You will need to do what I guide you to do, and trust that I will not harm the interests of your people, that when this ends you will have what I promised you, that I wish to give you all that is rightly yours. A hitch in her words, a stumble. Can you obey me? What was rightly Priya's? Are you rightly mine? Can I keep you too? Do you ask all the kings who serve you to obey you? Priya asked. Not so directly, said Molini. With them I play the necessary games and niceties. I write pacts and bargains. I flatter and dole out power as required. But you are not them, and I am asking you. Will you believe me if I say yes? Priya asked. You've placed your life in my hands before, Molini said softly. The deals we have struck between us have always held true. I'll trust you again, as I always have, and always shall. Don't say such things, Priya said. Molini's response was silence. She stood tall, elegant, and untouchable in her green sari, her flowering crown, her eyes pinning Priya through the heart. This isn't how I thought it would be, Priya thought. She had the absurd desire to reach out and unspool Molini's hair, to trace her eyebrows, her jaw, her mouth, with a fingertip, to feel her skin, to touch her. Maybe that would make Molini real. Maybe it would knot them back together again. I wish, Molini began, and then she caught herself, almost visibly, a slight sway of her body, a flicker of her eyelids, as if she felt too the urge to move closer to one another, the urge to touch, the urge to say, you're here, and I'm here, at last. Priya swallowed, steadying herself. She pushed her shoulders back, straightened herself, grounding her feet against the soil. If Molini could wear a mask, then so could she. Empress, she said, louder, clearer, drawing the eyes and ears of the men around them. Ahiranya is loyal to you. That has not changed. Molini straightened too, inclined her head. I am glad, Elder Priya, she said. So glad. Priya and Sima both worked together to make something presentable out of Priya. A salwar kameez in the Aloran style that better suited horse travel, with the chunni knotted neatly at her hip. Priya's hair bound back in a long braid that Sima hastily wound in place using a long, deep blue tasseled paranda. By the end, Priya at least felt presentable. It would have to do. They rode to join the army. When they entered the camp itself, Priya tried not to allow herself to be overwhelmed by the size and sheer scale of it. The milling swaths of soldiers in their bright armor, Saketa's great maize fort looming over everything, dark, stoned, and austere, the canopied tents, the elephants, the weapons, the waiting highborn, their cold, watchful eyes, the way they stared as Priya rode forward on her horse and alighted, her braid whipping behind her as she hit the soil. Let them stare. She was a temple elder. She had more power in her bones than any of them had in their titles. Priya walked forward, awaiting her beneath a canopy of gold on a dais that clearly served as a throne, sat Molini. Empress Molini, in all her glory, legs crossed and hands upon her knees. The softness in her was all gone. What remained was hard and beautiful, as bitterly sharp as a blade. I wanted you to see. Molini had showed her a little bit of the mask, the edges that made an empress out of a woman, and here, now, was the rest of it. Yogesh stepped forward first. In a clear voice he announced Priya, Temple Elder of Ahiranya. Come forward, another official announced, repeating his words in court Divban and common tongue Zaban, and pay your respects. You're Ahiranya's representative, Priya told herself. Think of what Bhumika would do and try to do it. Do not make a mess of this. She walked forward, bowed low, lower ever than she had before. I am a servant of Parijatvipa, every inch of her body said. I am loyal. I am here for your sake, and I will obey. Welcome, Elder, Molini said. I welcome you to Saketa. With the light of the sun behind her, Molini looked like a stranger, and that was, Priya supposed, exactly how things were meant to be. Empress, she said, it is my honor.